On today's Locked On Jayhawks, why Kansas has to beat Kansas State in 2024 to have a successful season, and Kansas to the SEC? Question mark.
You are Locked On Jayhawks, your daily podcast on the Kansas Jayhawks. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
I'm Derek Johnson. You can find me on Twitter at DJohnsonRadio. You can find our show here with Locked On Jayhawks anywhere you get your podcast, including on our YouTube page where you can like and subscribe to the action. We have a KU Football Friday edition of the episode. Why does Kansas have to beat Kansas State in 2024 to have a successful season? We'll finish up with some Kansas to the SEC talk. That's been kind of a rumor that's been going around the interwebs over the last couple of days. First, today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply with Game Time. All right, so let's start right here. Why does Kansas have to beat Kansas State in 2024 to have a successful season? Well, I mean, first of all, you've lost so many consecutively that you need to beat your rival finally. But, you know, that represents a big opportunity here in another year 4 now for the Lance Leipold staff, finally beating your rival. That is something you have to eventually do. And there are a lot of reasons why you need to do that. You know, one, for the starving fans that you're finally trying to win that game. 2, it would represent a bit of symbolism of trying to usurp this other team in your state who has been one of the better teams in your conference each and every year. And, you know, you win one game. It doesn't completely change that, but it makes it feel like you're heading in the right direction. And you also look at in-state recruiting. The impact of finally being able to win that game would be very important, not just because there will be a lot of in-state recruits at the game, as there were for the Kansas State one in Lawrence this past year, but just in terms of, you know, kids growing up and seeing, oh, Kansas State has won, 15 straight games, or I forget what it is, 14, 15, whatever, that has a real impact on in-state recruiting. And then, I mean, you had a great shot at doing it this past season in 2023, and you missed that kill shot, so to speak. But there are a lot of reasons why you need to do this to have a successful season. And yes, like, theoretically, are there ways to still have a successful season? If you go 11-1 and lose the Kansas State game and that's your only loss, is that still a successful season? Of course it's still a successful season. But realistically, or being realistic here, along the way, if you want to have that special season where you are competing for a Big 12 title, where you are possibly going to the college football playoff, where you are going to a Big 12 championship game, you kind of do need to beat this team who is in your way, who isn't just a rival, but is another really good team. And so, yes, there is the aspect of the rivalry and trying to get that first win in the rivalry for this coaching staff and trying to beat KState for the first time in forever. And what that would mean to the fans, what that would mean to the players, what that would mean for all that stuff like recruiting. It's also that the Big 12 title race, you know, you look at it right now, certainly it seems like there's going to be about a handful of teams that have a shot at winning the Big 12 this year. You look at what Utah and Arizona are coming in from the Pac-12 with, like they're certainly going to have a shot at doing it. Would it shock anybody if a team who has a talent-rich area like a UCF or a TCU or a Baylor or something, right? Even though we've seen those schools have years where maybe they're around 500 or below 500, we've also seen them have years like that and then they bounce back the next season and win 10 or 11 games. So, like, would it shock anybody if one of those schools was competing for it? And I don't know which one, but just, you know, toss it into a bag and one of them ends up doing it. No, it wouldn't. But Kansas and Kansas State are two teams that are both high up there in terms of the odds to win the Big 12. Pretty much no matter where you look, you're looking at 2 top 5 teams to win the Big 12. If you're looking at like betting odds, like Kansas is basically top 4 there. Kansas State is like top 2 to 3, kind of depending where you're looking at. And so it's not just about finally beating your rival, which does have a huge amount of importance. And I say all the time, like, that is kind of what college sports is built on, is built on those regional rivalries and those bragging rights games that make it a little bit different than some other leagues and stuff. But the Big 12 title race, K-State is in that race. And so you're playing them in Manhattan. And like I said, you could still lose that game and still make it to the Big 12 title. If they lose some other games and stuff, it's a road game for you. It's probably the best opponent, at least on paper right now. You don't know. Maybe a team ends up surprising you. Maybe Iowa State ends up being a 9 or 10 win team. Maybe, one of these other schools you're playing, Houston, ends up, coming together and having a great team. That it doesn't end up being the case. But right now on paper, that is your best opponent you're playing, and it happens to be a road game for you. So if you steal one on the road against the best team you're playing, in theory, you're basically saying you've accomplished your biggest roadblock in your way to winning all your games or to making the Big 12 title. Everything else should be easier from there. Again, it doesn't guarantee you don't get tripped up in an easier game because that's college football. Chaos happens. Weird stuff happens. But in theory, if you win that game, it makes everything else a little bit easier. But it also picks somebody else off who could be in competition with you to try to win a Big 12 title, to try to make it to the Big 12 championship game. It gives them another loss. It gives you another win. It gives them a home loss, which you're more so counting when you're looking at the title contenders in the conference. It's more so like which tough games they have on the road. So if you're able to beat them at home, that's another big win there. And it gives you the tiebreaker in the head-to-head. And in a year where Kansas, doesn't have the most difficult Big 12 schedule in the world, like they don't have to play Utah this year. They don't have to play Arizona. Yes, you do have Kansas State, and yes, Iowa State should be pretty good. And like I said, like with schools like TCU and Houston, some of these schools are in talent-rich areas. Any of them could blow up in any given year and have that right class that kind of comes together and they have a great year. But on paper right now, KU's schedule is not as difficult as some of these other schools. And that's obviously in counter to what it was this past season where Kansas had to play like every school in the top, whatever it was, 6 or 7 of the Big 12, except for West Virginia this past season. Whereas like West Virginia didn't play like anybody in like the top, I forget what it was, like top 5 or 6 or something of the conference. Sometimes these things just balance out. And so you have struck gold with your schedule this year. Take advantage. And to that point, like with the Kansas State game, it's not just about capitalizing on this season in terms of the schedule and what you could possibly do with Texas and Oklahoma leaving and all the players you have coming back and what this would mean to the Big 12 title in terms of taking advantage of that season where you feel like you actually have a shot at trying to win your first conference title. But it's also because there is a little bit of like, if not now, then when. And that's kind of the last part of this with why beating K-State would be so important and make things so successful, because Kansas loses a ton of production after the 2024 season. Think of guys like Devin Neal and your 3 starting receivers and some guys on the offensive line and the defensive line and guys like Cornell Wheeler and Kobe Bryant and Mello Dotson and Marvin Grant and O.J. Burrow. There's a lot of players Kansas can be losing at the end of the season. You could be losing Jalen Daniels at the end of the year. Technically, he does have 2 years left to play, but feels like kind of the expectation is for him to come in this year, ball out, and then go off to the NFL draft. And if that happens, he's healthy, balls out, goes off to the NFL draft. I think everybody would be happy with that because that means that it probably was a pretty good season. But anyway, you're going to be losing a lot after this 2024 season. And so you go into 2025 where that's going to be more of kind of a retooling year for Kansas, you think. Whereas with Kansas State, you look at, okay, right now this year they're starting a sophomore quarterback in Avery Johnson. I guess he was able to retain his redshirt. So a redshirt freshman in Avery Johnson. The further you go down that list, the older he's going to be getting. The older guy like Dylan Edwards will be. And Kansas has recruited really well here in high school that you would think 2026, 2027, like they have really high ceiling in those seasons. But it's kind of is like, if not now, then when, because it feels like things have set up for you that this is one of the best rosters on paper coming into a season that you've had in quite some time. If you can't get it done now, especially off the heels of a game in which you probably should have won last season, if not for a muff punt or drop pick 6 and some of these things that you just didn't do, and they never make those mistakes against you. They just play the more clean game. You maybe win that game, but you didn't. And so now, if not now, then win. So very important for KU to win this game from the rivalry aspect, finally getting that monkey off their back. If not now, then win, but also for that Big 12 title race and for Kansas to have as special of a season as possible. Let's continue on here with a recap of KU's spring portal editions, because now they have a trio of them. And are they done? Are they not? We'll discuss those, and also a little bit on the rumors of Kansas to the SEC on this episode of Locked on Jayhawks. First, this episode of the show is brought to you by Game Time, an authorized ticket marketplace of the NBA, which makes getting playoff tickets even faster and even easier. Prices on the Game Time app actually go down the closer it gets to tip-off. They have killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee, which allows Game Time to take the guesswork out of buying NBA tickets. They have the seat views where you can see that panoramic view from your seat in the app before you buy. And with Game Time ticket coverage, your purchase is covered with the most flexible customer service policy in the ticketing industry. Take the guesswork out of buying NBA tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONCollege, LOCKEDONCOLLEGE. That's all one word, for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets. Lowest price, guaranteed. All right, recapping what's gone on in the portal for KU. Are they done? Are they not at this point for KU football? Well, so far they've added Amil Herring, the offensive lineman from Michigan, who will come in as a redshirt freshman, former four-star recruit. By Jobe, the former top 60 recruit in the country, who will also be a redshirt freshman, defensive end from Michigan State. And then most recently, earlier this week, Leyton, who is a tight end who will be a fourth-year sophomore this upcoming season. And he was from Fort Hays State. And he, it sounds like, will be kind of a preferred walk-on this year because Kansas is like full up on scholarships, it sounds like. So with Herring and Jobe, that gets you to the full up. And then Cure will come in as a preferred walk-on. Maybe the expectation, though, would be that he is a preferred walk-on this year. You use maybe NIL money to basically pay for the scholarship. And then come the following season, he ends up getting a scholarship and earning that scholarship. These are huge pickups for KU. I mean, you can't always count on getting a bunch of great additions in the spring portal. Less players are out there. Teams are more desperate at that point to find their final additions to the roster or something they feel they need. And so it's going to be more competition for those guys. And for KU to land players with the future potential of Herring and Jobe and a guy in Cure who, I mean, it sounds like Jeff Grimes really, really liked this kid. That like I don't even know if Jeff Grimes like knew he was put it this way. Obviously, there's the tie with Lincoln Cure, and that's what everybody has jumped to. That this is why you're bringing him on to help you with Lincoln Cure. I don't think that's the case. Like, yes, that is a nice side effect of that, but like I think they would add Leyton Cure regardless of what happened there. I think Jeff Grimes really liked him enough, and like it wouldn't shock me if he ends up being their third tight end this season. And then if you are the third tight end this season, that would put you in line to be the starter next season because Trevor Cardell and Jared Casey are going to be seniors here in 2024. So who would be that guy in 2025, right? So these are huge pickups for the depth of this year's team. These are huge pickups for the long term of this team for 2025, for 2026. They're ceiling raisers for this team and the future. And with how much they do lose at the end of this season. And you have a small sophomore class, like adding two redshirt freshmen, so basically two sophomores. And again, in Cure, what is a fourth-year sophomore, that's going to help weather that storm a little bit. So these are huge additions for KU. The question now becomes, will they add anyone else? I just said they were, I believe, full up on scholarships, and I still believe that to be true, but they just added a preferred walk-on. So could you do the same thing where you add basically a PWO and you pay them with NIL money to have a scholarship? Or could there be a player who maybe, I don't know, medically retires and ends up not playing football and you just bring them on as a like assistant coach or something like that because their career is going to be over? I don't know if that's possible. But there are basically ways to work around it, so to speak. Could you have somebody gray shirt? It'd be a little late in the game to probably have that conversation, but still, point being, there are different avenues you can explore if you do want to add another player. And it certainly seems like KU would be open to bringing on another player if they're good enough. Probably not going to bring on somebody else just for depth at this point in time. But if you bring on a player who maybe is starting level good, that could be something to keep an eye on. So, whether it's somebody on the offensive line, maybe a center that you could bring on because it sounds like you've been having to play Michael Ford there. Maybe the Shane Bumgarner thing didn't work as much as you hoped, even though, there still is time for him to figure it out. Could you do that? Could you bring on a linebacker? That's something that certainly it wouldn't hurt to add kind of more of too. And I've kind of hypothesized before that, if you did add another linebacker, what if it allowed you to move JB Brown, who we saw play some defensive end, to defensive end and give you even more of a ready-made player at defensive end right now that you've kind of been looking for? And maybe by Jobe ends up being that guy. But, point being, I don't think Kansas, the shop is closed, so to speak. I think there's still some rumors percolating out there. All right, let's talk some fun superlatives with the 3 new additions. Here's going to be a little fun game I play with myself. Best chance to be a starter in 2024 among these 3: Leyton, by Jobe, and Amil Herring. I don't think it's Herring. KU has a lot of offensive line talent back, but still, it wouldn't be crazy if Amil Herring ends up being on the 2 deep at some point. I don't know. It seemed like he might have been on the 2 deep as a second string in the spring for Michigan, but who knows if he would have been second string or third string or what, and all of that stuff. It's going to take him time. It's going to take all these guys time because they weren't here for spring ball and they have to get to know the playbook and the staff and the scheme and everything. And kind of you're playing catch up in fall ball when most of the other guys are just kind of getting ready for the season, I guess. So that'll be interesting. But I think like I said, it's going to be tough. You have 2 seniors in front of you. Jobe, I think, is the best chance to be a starter in 2024 because that wide defensive end spot is wide open. And with Jobe, the Michigan State roster listed him at like 250. Let's say he's even 240. That at least gets you in the ballpark of like Austin Booker. Whereas with like Deshaun Warner and Dak Brinkley, even though I think you might have to see them hit the field at least rotationally, even if it's, hey, you play 4 games, you play the next 4 games, so it gives you 8 games between the 2 guys. I don't know. But Jobe might be the most ready there. So I think he has the best chance to be a starter in 2024, certainly at the beginning of the season. What about the best chance to be a starter come 2025? See, that's one where even though I'd argue Jobe in 2024, and you would say, well, if Jobe's going to be a starter in 2024, then wouldn't he be a starter in 2025 too? Yes, but that's under the guise of saying, for sure by Jobe would be a starter in 2024. Whereas that still is a percentage play that it could be somebody else. I think Amil Herring could be your best shot to be a starter come 2025 because now you're talking about Michael Ford is departing. Shane Bumgardner would be graduating. There's both your centers, and Amil Herring could be your center of the future as soon as 2025. Even if he's not, you look at like Daryl Simmons on the interior of the offensive line, like he's going to be graduating at the end of the season. You're going to have some openings that maybe Amil Herring kind of takes over. And I made the comparison earlier that, you brought in Kobe Baines during fall camp a couple of years ago. Now that was like a week or 2 into fall camp, so a little bit different there. But by the middle of the season, end of the season, he was getting some rotational play here or there. And then by, season 2 for him, which was last season in 2023, he ends up being a starter for KU. And so I could see something like that happening for Amil Herring too. What about this? Best chance to get on the field first in 2024, not necessarily a starter. So I still think this is by Jobe, just because you're going to rotate defensive ends. He's going to get playing time, I'd imagine, for KU. Honestly, though, second on this list might be Leyton because everything I said with Herring, if you're comparing him to Kobe Baines, it took through about the middle point back half of the season for him to get on the field, just getting aware with everything. And yes, Cure has to figure everything out in the offense too, but I think there is a lot of KU has more options on the offensive line and depth on the offensive line than maybe they do at depth at tight end. Like you feel good about the first 2 tight ends with Cardell and Casey, but after the Hanukkah injury, it makes the question for who is tight end 3 a little bit more up in the air. Tavita Noah hasn't been able to kind of lock down that spot so far in his collegiate career. Jaden Ham is still kind of a young, raw prospect. You have some other preferred walk-ons that are on the roster that could, maybe take that spot. And I think Cure has as good of a shot as any. And if he ends up being the 3rd tight end, KU plays formations with 3 tight ends. That's going to get you on the field. Last one here, best chance to be an NFL draft pick. Jobe would be the answer. And if Jobe ends up hitting, if Jobe ends up being an all Big 12 player, he could be a day 1 or day 2 draft pick because you're talking about a former top 60 recruit who's super athletic, and he has that type of story with his athleticism and not playing football for a super long time. All right, let's continue on. Kansas to the SEC. That was kind of a rumor that's been floated around. Let's discuss, where did the rumor come from? How reliable is it? And what exactly would it mean? Why would it make sense? Would it make sense at all on this episode of Locked On Jayhawks? First, this episode of the show is brought to you by Monopoly Go. Game off. We got to pause here to talk more about Monopoly Go. I know what you're saying. Flag on the play. You already talked about that, but there's so much good stuff in the game. In Monopoly Go, you can team up with friends for time tournaments where you work together to build up each other's board. The more you win together, the more awesome prizes you unlock, and there's so much to get. Unique stickers you can trade with friends to complete albums for big prizes. Cool new playing pieces to travel the boards with. Hilarious emojis for taunting friends when you smash their buildings or heist their vaults. Plus, Monopoly Go feels new and exciting every day with constantly changing tournaments and challenges. A ton include their own unique minigames like digging for treasure or a robot pachinko machine. And there's always new timed events that help you win big, like massive multipliers for everything you win or rent frenzies. There's always something fun to discover in Monopoly Go. So get off the bench and go download it now free on Google Play or the App Store. Game on. Finishing things up on this KU Football Friday with Kansas to the SEC. How serious should we take these rumors? So there's this guy, Greg Flugauer. I don't know if that's the proper way to pronounce it, but he has a YouTube channel talking college football. He has over 10,000 followers on Twitter. He was actually the one who broke the news about USC's interest in the Big Ten and that happening, the realignment stuff with the Big Ten. And the LA Times actually wrote a piece about him and some of his stuff. The reason I'm telling you this is it's not like he's Adam Schefter, but seems to be pretty plugged in, or at least has that proven piece to make you interested in what he is saying here in the realignment game, though I still would say take this with a grain of salt. But anyway, he shared last night that it's not imminent or guaranteed, but Kansas at 20 is a phrase that will grow in usage in the next couple of years at the SEC, to the SEC. What does that mean, Kansas at 20? They're at 16 right now. They would be adding 4 schools, and Kansas would be to get them to 20. He added in that next round, which could be in a few years, it could be an addition of North Carolina, Clemson, Virginia, and then Kansas at 20. And the idea being that the SEC has mastered football to this point. Clemson would certainly only add to that. North Carolina's had some really good years, so they would kind of add to that too. But they've also been a really good basketball conference. I think you would say that the Big 12 and the Big East have been the 2 best basketball conferences here over the last handful of years. And then the SEC would probably be third. And they've used a lot of their football money that they've had success with, I think, to help invest in the basketball programs and bring in some really good coaches. There are a lot of really good coaches and a lot of entertaining teams and really good teams that have been in the SEC over these past couple of seasons. Now, imagine you have a league where, if you're adding these schools, you have Kansas, Kentucky, and North Carolina, in addition to all those other schools that are having strong runs recently. At that point, you're not just the king of football, which they've already kind of been, but are you the king of basketball at that point too? I mean, the Big 12 would certainly be up there, but once you're taking away Kansas and putting them to the SEC and adding North Carolina to the SEC too, it's I don't know, because that would be 3 of the bluest blue bloods that are out there. I'll say this, I'm not going to just assume this happens, but it definitely piques my interest. And certainly as these mega conferences kind of increase, they're going to be looking to get pockets of teams that allow them to figure out scheduling or split into divisions or mini conferences. And yes, the whole thing is stupid that you're going to have these conferences that are, 20, 24, 30 teams big, who knows by the end of it. And then they're going to have to split up into mini conferences, which are probably just going to be geographically like we originally had it, but whatever. As they're doing that, you have the Kansas-Missouri rivalry. You have Arkansas nearby with Kansas. You have Oklahoma, Texas, and Texas A&M as old Big 12 teams that doesn't hurt. Plus the KU-Kentucky, KU-Carolina rivalries that could emerge in basketball. It makes some sense, as crazy as it would sound, to be Kansas, after all the bad years they've had in football, they're really going to go to the SEC. Well, Vanderbilt's in the SEC. I do remain steadfast, though, that I would prefer Kansas. If you had the option of the Big 10 or the SEC, I'm taking the Big 10 if I'm Kansas. And that's not necessarily saying that the Big 10 is better than the SEC. I just think fit-wise, it makes more sense when you look at the AAU institutions and, I don't know, geographically and some of the culture fits seem to make more sense for me with KU in the Big 10 than the SEC. But you don't know that invite's going to ever come. And if you're given the offer from the SEC, you jump on it without hesitation. And yes, going back to the football thing, it would make it very difficult for Kansas in football. There is that argument, which I'm totally here for, that staying in the Big 12 and having a better shot at doing well. And therefore, because if we're going to an expanded playoff and you win the Big 12, you're in the college football playoff, like your access to actually winning your conference, to actually making the college football playoff are better being in the Big 12 than they would be in the SEC. And I get that. There also, could you not have just made that argument, though, when Kansas was in the Big 12 and they were doing bad at football, and said that, well, they should just go to the Mountain West because then they'll be better at football? But they didn't. And you just try to adjust to what conference you're in and figure it out and hope you can find that right coach and team and everything like that. Here's the bigger thing, though. I'll say this. Like, I think the hope there would be if you did do that, even though you know that, hey, maybe it puts a bit more of a ceiling on you where it's like, hey, maybe – instead of competing for a conference title this year, Kansas would be competing for 8 or 9 wins or whatever. But the hope would be being in the SEC does raise your recruiting level even more to pair with, you have a great coach in Lance Leipold. So if you're getting better players at that point and more money from the SEC and able to use that in NIL, like that does actually make you better. The hope would also be that by joining a league, they'd be going to 20, and who knows if they'd expand past that, that you would be placed in a good pocket or a good division or a good like scheduling area in football that would make it a more winnable area. Like when the Big 12 had the North and the South, where one side was tougher than the other, that would be the hope. But here's my main reason why you'd have to take it. And again, I do understand the idea of being like, well, wouldn't you rather have a lot of success and be able to have that? The main reason you take it, I guess, honestly, from the school's perspective, the main reason they take it is the money factor. Like that's number one, all the money. I'm not actually getting any of the money, so that's not my number one factor, but I can understand that because it would be a huge jump in money in what they could do for the school and the athletic departments and buildings and all that stuff. But it's to be able to have a ticket for when the conferences or the powers that be depart from the NCAA, because that rumor has gone around now for a year or two. And who knows if it's actually true, but I kind of feel like it's going to be true. Who knows if it's in 10 years, 20 years, the rumor of that, like the Big Ten and the SEC or whatever, like the big leagues would basically secede away from the NCAA at some point and start their own league down the road, separate of some of this other stuff. And so if you have an opportunity to get on board with that, to be in the haves as opposed to the have-nots, to be in that top tier where it doesn't just set you up to be in that haves versus have-nots in football, but it sets you up to be in the right classification of teams for basketball, for all your Olympic sports, for everything that you do. You get on board and you just kind of deal with the football thing and hope that you can be as good as possible and hope that a rising tide raises all ships or whatever. So I don't know. If you're asking me my preference, I would love to go back to the old days where conferences were 6 to 12 teams and they were all about regional and rivalries and all that stuff. But cat's out of the bag at this point. And so if you're giving me the option to do it, I would do it if I was Kansas, even though it certainly would make winning in football a lot tougher. That'll do it for this episode of Locked On Jayhawks. You can find our show anywhere you get your podcast, including on our YouTube page. We'll be back next week unless any breaking news happens with LOJ. Make sure you subscribe to the show.